So today we are about to begin chapter number 29 in part 3 of the Mor Nevuchim in the Guide for the Perplexed. Again, when I use page numbers, we're about to start page 515. I'm referring to the Shlomo Pinas edition here of the guide, volume 2. And the Rambam is now beginning to explain to us the reasons for the mitzvah, why the Torah makes sense, right? So we have to really, and I'm going to go a little bit of a matter of introduction, right? According to the Rambam, it's crucial that the Torah makes sense, right? It has to make logical, philosophical, sociological, political sense, right? So that we can understand why the Torah told us to do the things that it tells us to do. The Rambam has said several times very emphatically that he refuses to agree with those who say that God just tells us to do things just because, or we do things because God said so. Even though there are many Jewish philosophers and thinkers over the ages that have posited such an idea, the Rambam is not one of them, right? And he's going to say that again and again and again. So he's trying to make sense of the Torah, right? So now he started giving us introductions last time, and in the last chapter he emphasized the mitzvot that understandably allow for the development of a functioning society. You know, a society where people get along, a society where the people's health and well-being can be nurtured, so that people can then devote some time to achieving spiritual greatness, which in the Rambam's mind means intellectually learning and knowing and understanding the entire world that's around us, everything around us. So, and ultimately by understanding that, to achieve Ahava, to achieve the love of God, which is the ultimate result of acquiring this kind of knowledge. And the Rambam also said that some of the mitzvot, so many of the mitzvot are obvious because they show us how to either not do things that would be a detriment to a healthy society, or do things that would be helpful to building a healthy society. But then there was also mitzvot, which the Rambam said are given to us with the purpose of teaching us proper ideas, proper philosophies, proper thoughts. So one of the things that the Rambam does here, which he's about to do, and it's pretty long in chapter 29. So, and I want to draw your attention to just how incredibly revolutionary it is, and how important it is to understanding the way the Rambam views the development of the Torah, the giving of the Torah, the mitzvot in general, and how controversial it could be, even if you look at it today, you know, so the Rambam is going to start to explain to us soon the reasons why the Torah commanded us to uproot avodah zarah. What was so important about the Torah to uproot paganism, right? All these mitzvot that were written to us to uproot paganism. This is what he's going to devote this chapter to. But in order to do that, the first thing he does is he shows us that what do you do when you want to understand the Torah? Okay, so what the Rambam, if there's parts of the Torah that don't seem to make sense, why would the Torah tell us to destroy the asherot, you know, the worshiping places where they worship trees? Or why would the Torah tell us to uproot paganism with such vigor? The Torah could just teach us the truth and move on and finish. Like, why is it so important? So in order to understand that, the Rambam goes and does historical research. He does the best he can with the extremely limited tools that someone would have in the 10th century in Egypt, right? He goes to the library and reads every book he can get his hands on what was the world like at the time of the Torah. What was paganism like when the Torah was given? In other words, in what milieu was the Torah given, so that we can understand the reasons for the Torah's commandments. Now think about that for a minute. I think it's important to let that sink in. We cannot expect that the Rambam's historical research would be the same as you or I would get if we decided to go to a seminar on the history of ancient, Middle Eastern pagan beliefs prior to the giving of the Torah, right? Because we would find out so many different things through so many different ways that were completely unavailable to the Rambam. He didn't have archaeology. He didn't read cuneiform from the Chaldeans and stuff. So there was no way he could have access to that. But what he did was he did the best he could, right, to portray a picture of what the world was like. So even if we're going to read this and say, well, this isn't what I learned in history class when I learned about Mesopotamian practices, before the monotheism came into the world, but I think his method of doing it is crucially important, because it goes to the heart of when we have parts of the Torah that we don't understand. The first thing we need to do is try to understand the milieu in which the Torah was given. When this command was given that doesn't seem to make sense to us, what was the situation that the people that received the Torah were in when they received that law, when God told them to do that? And think about that for a minute. So what the Rambam is doing here, he's going to teach us that process. And then you and I can do the process. We can do it a lot better than him, right? Because now we have access to so much more information. We can understand even more the context within which many of these mitzvot and commandments were given. Now, what that does is it gives us a huge amount of intellectual leeway when it comes to understanding the Torah. And I can promise you that many very fundamentalist religious people today, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or whatever, would have a lot of difficulty with what I'm telling you right now. They would get very uncomfortable with me saying that, for example, the mitzvah of Amalek, right, which is one of the hardest mitzvot, you have to wipe out the nation. Like, how do we understand that today? Well, the only way to try to understand, and I'm not going to go into that specifically now, but the first thing you need to do is wind back a couple thousand years and think about what Amalek was as a menace to society at the time. And think about the way people waged warfare at the time. And think about why God was good. That is the beginning of the way to understanding the mitzvot. And this is what the Rambam is telling us. He's giving us the permission, and not just the permission, but he's telling us this is how you have to understand it. And with this key, it's going to be long. It's going to be several pages. With this key, he's going to use it to explain several of the mitzvot that otherwise don't seem to make any sense. And you'll see examples like the mitzvah of shatnez, mixing wool and linen. The next question we're going to logically ask ourselves when we see this is, well, if that's true, then I now understand why it was relevant then, but why should it still be relevant 2,000 years later now? That's an obvious question, and we're going to deal with that question, but we're not there yet. So I'm giving you this introduction because I really want you to appreciate just how revolutionary and just how intellectually gutsy this is. I mean, this is what he's about to do. So he's about to talk about Abraham. Now remember that that Abraham was highly revered by, and still to this day, by Islam, right? So the main milieu within which the religious milieu within which the Rambam was functioning was dominated by Islam, and the Rambam, of course, has been talking and quoting and dealing with the Islamic scholars throughout this entire book. So Abraham, as the forefather of monotheism, is deeply embedded in both of our religions, in Judaism and in Islam, and also in Christianity. But Rambam doesn't deal with Christianity that much because that wasn't the primary thing he was dealing with. But although we did see some references here and there. But anyway, so Avraham Avinu is the quintessential person. He's the person who founded the idea of monotheism and discovered it on his own. And a lot of what the Rambam attributes to Avraham Avinu, it does not come from the Torah itself, right? The Torah itself says nothing about this monumental idea of Avraham Avinu, of Abraham, coming up with the idea of monotheism and teaching it. Most of that comes down to us in the form of traditions, Midrashim, Mamari Chazal in the Gemara, in the Talmud somewhere, sayings, ideas, so on and so forth. In the Islamic tradition, they also have all kinds of stories, but that are similar in many ways. But so there's tradition and stories, but none of them are actually in the Torah. So you can't just keep that in mind. So now let's see what he's going to do. Now I gave that introduction. Now let's try to see how he's going to do this. Chapter 29 in the middle of page 514. It is well known that Abraham, our father, peace be upon him, was brought up in the religious community of the Sabians. The Sabians is Rambam's catch term for pagans, okay? Monotheistic societies of pagans, whose doctrine it is that there is no deity but the stars. Now, what the Rambam knew about these Sabians, right? And remember, nowadays, you and I, we look back at prehistory, we're thinking about cultures all around the planet, right? Of all different types and all different kinds of beliefs. We can't expect the Rambam to have been knowledgeable about all those things, right? He's knowledgeable about that which he had access to, right? So he knows about the Sabians, right? And well, I shall have made known to you in this chapter their books. I'm going to give you a summary of the books of the Sabians, because the Rambam went and he's going to list in a couple of pages from now many books, either about or by the Sabians, right, which the Rambam read thoroughly in order to understand the milieu within which the Torah was given. Just wrap your mind around that and think, when next time you're talking to somebody in Torah and you want to tell them, if you really want to understand the Torah, you have to read the books of the people and have to understand the time, the history that it was given. Just try to, that's the main lesson I really want you to get out of this chapter, not what the Rambam's idea about the Sabians, although that might be interesting for whatever. So here we go. And their ancient chronicles, and I shall have revealed to you through them their doctrines and histories. I'm going to tell you the histories that the Sabian of their lifestyle and how they lived and how they believed and what their doctrines were. It will become clear to you from this that they explicitly asserted that the stars are the deity and that the sun is the greatest deity. They looked at all the stars in the sky and worshiped them as the deity, okay? They also said that the rest of the 7 stars, the identified planets, and those planets included, of course, the sun and the moon, or anything that rotated in some way, shape, or form around the world was one of the 7 stars, but that the 2 luminaries, meaning the sun and the moon, are the greatest of them. You will find that they explicitly say that the sun governs the upper and lower world, and they say it in these very terms. And you will find that they mention in these books, the Sabians refer to this guy, Avraham Avinu, this guy, Abraham, right? And they say literally as follows. We'll see in a minute which book the Rambam is quoting, right? And it turns out that this book is really a fraud, but the Rambam didn't know that, but that's fine. The point is not the story. The point is the method. And that's really, I know I said that 1,000 times, but I'll probably say it a few more times, right? So, this is what they have in their book. When Ibrahim, right, who was brought up in Kuta, right, which is the community somewhere in Babylon, the town, disagreed with the community and asserted that there was an agent other than the sun. So the Sabians record that they had an argument with this Abraham guy, right, and this Abraham was saying, no, it's not the sun, there's someone else, right? And various arguments, and they argued back and forth. In these arguments, they set forth the clear and manifest activities of the sun and what exists. And they describe the sun and they battle each other with philosophical arguments. Thereupon he, meaning Avram, told them, you are right. It is like an axe in the hands of a carpenter. Yes, it's true that the sun does all these things, but the sun is just a tool in the hands of the one who's operating the sun. Then they mention a part of his argumentation, peace be upon him, against them. And then they quote what Abraham said in his arguments against the Sabians. At the conclusion of the story, they mentioned that the king put Abraham, may peace be upon him, into prison, and that being in prison, he persevered for days and days in arguing against them. Thereupon the king became afraid that he would ruin his polity and turn the people away from their religions and banish them towards Syria after having confiscated all his property. This is what they relate. You will find this story set forth in this manner in the Nabatean Agriculture. That's a book that the Rambam is quoting from. It's a book that was written by I forgot who, an early Islamic scholar in like sometime in the 9th century, and he wrote it claiming that he was translating from Chaldean, an ancient Sabian book, right? But really, it was a total fraud. I mean, we know that now, but the Rambam didn't know that then. It's not an ancient. He never translated anything from ancient Chaldean, although it's very possible that there are some, traditions that fall in there. And of course, the story we just read should sound somewhat familiar to us from the Medrash, of the Rambam being thrown into jail, eventually being thrown into a furnace because he was arguing about monotheism. So these stories bounced around the culture all around, and they made its way into this book that this guy wrote. I can't remember his name, but it's not that important right now. Regardless, this is the source the Rambam is using. He is reading this book thinking that it is a genuine book of Chaldean philosophy, right, and history. So now they do not mention what is related in our true traditions and the prophetic revelation that came to him. They don't talk about how Abraham had a prophetic revelation of true monotheism. That they don't go into. For they tax him with lying because of his disagreeing with their corrupt opinion. They claim that he was a liar and so on. That's how their story makes it out in their book, right? You imagine this Islamic scholar would write it as if Abraham was considered by the ancient Sabians as being a liar, right? I have no doubt that in the view of the fact that he, may peace be upon him, meaning Abraham, disagreed with the doctrine of all men, these erring men reviled, blamed, and belittled him. It must be that that's what happened. You have to think back, Rambam is saying. What must it have been like for a guy to get up and claim there's one God while the whole world is walking around saying, no, there's all these gods and this and this and the sun and the moon and the stars, they're all gods, etc. And preferred truth to his reputation. And accordingly, because he bore this for the sake of God, because Abraham, despite being hated and despised by all the people around, right? He must have been hated, reviled, but nonetheless, he stuck with the truth, which is why it says, and I will bless them that bless you, and I'll curse those that curse you. So the Rambam is using this understanding of the milieu. Why did Avraham Avinu say? Why did God promise Abraham that I will bless those that bless you and curse those that? Because there must have been a lot of people walking around cursing him, right? So it's a very logical kind of blessing, right? It's trying to understand the verse within the context of the times, within the context of history. This is truly revolutionary, what the Rambam is doing here. There are very few places prior to the Rambam where people analyzed and understood the Torah that way. When they took a verse and said, what was going on in history at the time? Nowadays, it's very common for scholars to do that. In fact, we consider that the most intellectually honest way to understand the Torah. Try our best to understand who was talking to who when, what was going on at that time. And then all of a sudden, the Rambam says, wow, now I understand why God said that. I'll bless those that bless you and curse those that curse you. And in point of fact, his activity has resulted, as we see today, in the consensus of the greater part of the population of the earth. Again, in Rambam's population of the earth, it includes the world of Islam, a couple of Jews running around in the middle, and the Christians in Europe, and then there's some far-flung empires out there, but that's all he really knew, right? So the greater population of the earth glorifying and considering themselves as blessed through his memory, and so that even those who do not belong to his progeny pretend to descend from him. He's throwing a little jest at the Muslims who also say that they descend from Ishmael, who descends from Abraham. They have a different tradition where they come from. No one is antagonistic to him or ignorant of his greatness, except the remnants of this religious community that is perished, except for the little leftovers, the few pagans that still exist, right? That survive at the extremities of the earth. For instance, the infidels among the Turks in the extreme north. Like if you go way up past Turkey into the northern regions of Europe and Asia, you'll still find a few remnants of those pagans, or the Hindus in the extreme south, right? And that's a mistake, obviously, but the Hindus are really in the extreme, east. Right, but regardless, so way out there, there's still some people, but that's it. Everyone else already gets that there's one God, right? These are the remnants of the religious community, the Sabians, for this was a religious community that extended over the whole earth. It used to be the entire world was these Sabians, right? Okay. So the utmost attained by the speculation of those who philosophized in those times, the highest that they ever achieved, consisted in imagining that God was the spirit of the sphere, and that the sphere and the stars are a body of which the deity, may he be exalted, is its spirit. The closest they came to real monotheism was thinking that maybe there's a deity, but the deity embodies himself within these stars and suns and moons and whatever. Abu Bakr ibn al-Sa'ig, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that correct, has mentioned this in the commentary on the Acroasis. Therefore, all the Sabians believed in the eternity of the world, since in their opinion, heaven is the deity. And which is interesting. And the Rambam is going to give an incongruity in a minute. Remember, we kind of banged this to death when we studied book 2, that in the idea of the eternity of the world was as an Aristotelian idea, and you can understand it with just the basic the following understanding, right? That if the rules of science dictate that the world is what it is, right? the rules of science dictate that humans do this and that lions do that and giraffes do this and trees grow this way and the mountains do this and so on and so forth. So then, and those rules of science are set in stone. They are the way they are because they have to be, right? Because that's the rules of science. Then whatever made the world be what it is today would have made the world be the same way yesterday and the day before, right? Because those same rules are in play. Whatever rules of science resulted in a world would have resulted in that same world 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000,000,000 years ago, and 8 bazillion gazillion years ago, right? It's always going to be the same world. So therefore, in Aristotle's mind, so in the Rambam's mind, someone who believes in science, when I say believes in science, what I mean is believes that the world is the way it is because it has to be, because the laws of science dictate that this is how the world has to be, will also believe in the eternity of the world. So in the Rambam's mind, if you believe in the eternity of the world, that means you also don't believe there's a creator, because if you believe there's a creator, then you believe that the world is the way it is because God decided that those words should be the rules, right? God made the world with certain rules, right? And yes, those rules stay. So therefore, there was a time. So now, if you don't have a creator, then you also, there's no possibility for magic or miracles. And think about this for a minute. There's nothing can happen without the confines of, outside of the confines of basic science. It's impossible. And the Rambam is going to bring this incongruity that makes no sense, right? If you are a Sabian and you believe in the eternity of the world, that means you believe like Aristotle. If you believe like Aristotle, then there's no place for miracles. It's impossible. And he's going to bring out this incongruity in a minute. Now, there's a million ways that you and I might deal with this incongruity, but we have to get ourselves into the Rambam's mindset and understand that in his mind, these two things made no sense, right? You and I might, there's a lot of ways that we can answer it, but it doesn't matter. The point is that in the way the Rambam understood history, these two ideas are incompatible. The only way you can make a place for a miracle at all is if you say there's a creator and you say that for whatever reason, right? And we talked about miracles, on and off many times. God decided that when he created the world, that under certain circumstances, such a thing should happen, right? And that's a miracle. That's how the Rambam explained to us miracles in a short nutshell, right? So there could be things that are outside of the law, the general laws of nature that you and I see every day, because God built into nature certain things that could happen. But if you don't have a creator, miracles are completely impossible. And one of the important outcomes of that is the entire idea of magic and sorcery and superstition. All that stuff is completely bogus, according to Rambam. And you have to understand how revolutionary that is, right? Rambam was living in a world where everyone pretty much believed in some form of superstitious magic, right? Obviously, still to this day, everyone does. But the Rambam is going to be saying in this chapter, and you have to understand the significance of what he's saying is that it's completely baloney, right? It's impossible, right? The only way you can believe in anything that seems to violate the laws of nature is if you have a creator. If you don't have a creator and you believe in any other system, it makes no sense at all, right? It's impossible. No such thing. And remember, this was the source of a famous machokas between the Rambam, and the Ramban and Nachmanides, because Nachmanides jumps in and says, no, right? There is such a thing as sorcery and tapping into all kinds of spirits and magic and things like that. And among the mystics, there's all kinds of stuff like that. But according to the Rambam, there's no place for that. There's none. No, it's completely baloney. If you see anything that looks fit, if you study it hard enough, you'll figure it out. It has to follow the laws of science. But now he's going to go on and continue. So they deem, I'm at the bottom of page 515. They deem Adam to have been an individual born of male and female. He's still quoting to us more stories from this book, like the other human individuals, but they glorify him and say, instead of saying he was the first human that was created by God, right? Because in their world, it's eternal, so every human has to come away about the same way every other human came about. So he must have been born from a mother and a father, and going all the way back until everywhere. Just keep going back, right? So they glorify and say that he was some kind of prophet, but he was the envoy of the moon, because the moon is a god, remember, and who called people to worship the moon. And there are compilations of his on the cultivation of the soil. Similarly, the Sabians say that Noah was also a cultivator of the soil, and he did not approve of the worship of idols. So this idea of Noah being faithful to God, made it into the Sabian book, right? Therefore, you will find that all the Sabians blame Noah, and they say that he never worshipped now. They say that it's Noah's fault that there was a flood because he should have worshipped idols like everyone else does. So in other words, they're just used. So if you imagine this Islamic guy, I wish I remembered his name, but I think it's in this. They quote him in the Goodman Lieberman book, but the guy that wrote the book that I'm telling you that the Rambam was quoting from, that the book is a fraud. But you can see why he would put onto the Sabians this idea. Like he would say, well, they have their version of Noah being the bad guy because he didn't worship the right deities and he wanted to worship God. They also mention in their books that he was beaten, put into prison because he was worshiping God, and tell other tales about him. They decided that they deemed that Seth, that disagreed with the opinion of his father Adam concerning the worship of the moon, and tell most ridiculous lies that show a great deficiency of intellect, and that they are more remote from philosophy than any other men, and they're extremely ignorant. All their stuff is all crazy stuff. Of Adam, they say that when he left the climb of the sun, which is in the vicinity of India, somewhere out in India was where the Garden of Eden was, and Adam came out and came to Babel, more towards the Mesopotamian area, and came to the climb of Babylon. He brought with him marvelous things, a golden tree and a stone tree. I'm going through this pretty quickly, and a green leaf of a tree. So these ideas of these magical trees, whether in our tradition in the Torah, it's the tree of knowledge or the tree of life, they had all these these fanciful trees. And he spoke of a tree, man's stature and height, that can give shelter to 10,000 men. All these legends. He also brought 2 leaves into which a leaf you can wrap people up, and it's so big you can wear the leaf. And also tell fables of other marvels. It is to be wondered at that people who think that the world is eternal. This is where he says what I told you before. The people that think the world is eternal, which means they think the world operates on scientific principles, right, should at the same time believe in these things that are impossible in nature, for those who have knowledge of the speculation on nature, right? At the same time that they claim scientific principles, they're saying all these magical, wonderful, crazy stories. It doesn't make sense, right? It's incongruous. It can't be. It's either one or the other, right? Either there's a creator and the miracles are possible, or there is no creator and miracles are impossible, right? Their purpose in mentioning Adam and everything they ascribe to him is to fortify their doctrine concerning the eternity of the world, right? So that it should follow that the stars and the sphere are the deity. However, I'm in this, starting the middle paragraph on page 516. When the pillar of the world, that is, meaning Avram Avinu, grew up, and I apologize for us going so deeply into this book about the Sabians, but I think it's important for us to see the Rambam's process, how he uses the historical knowledge. And we're going to see soon he read through a long list of other books about the Sabians in order to understand the commands that were given to us regarding idolatry. Okay, so it is important for us to go through this process, even if it seems a little fantastical. However, when Avram Avinu grew up and it became clear to him that there's a separate deity, when Avram Avinu realized that God is completely separate from everything here, he's not a body nor a force in a body, and that all the stars and the spheres were made by him. He was the creator of it all, but he's totally separate. He has nothing to do in the sense that he's completely a different entity, right? And he understood that the fables upon which he was brought up were absurd. He began to refute their doctrine and to show up their opinions as false. He publicly manifested his disagreement with them and called in the name of the Lord, God of the world, B'Shem Hashem Kel Olam, both the existence of the deity and the creation of the world in time by that deity being comprised in that call. But by saying that there is a God who created everything, the world is not eternal, the world was created at a moment in time, and Avram Avinu went and tried to teach people his new philosophy, his new idea of monotheism. In conformity with these opinions, right? So now, because these Sabians had all these crazy ideas, they set up statues for the planets, golden statues for the sun, and silver ones for the moon, distributed the minerals and the climes between the planets, saying that one particular planet was the deity of one particular clime. They said that, if you have in a certain area, right, this God rules over this, right? This God rules over the mountains. This God rules over the sea. This God rules over this bunch of mountains, right? So, and they built temples and set up statues in them and thought that the forces of the planets overflowed towards those statues, and consequently these statues talked. If you worship them, you could get inspiration from the statues because these statues the gods resided within them and had understanding and gave prophetic revelation to people, you can see why a logically philosophical person like the Rambam would find such ideas to be absurd and repugnant and dangerous, right? I mean, and you'll see why soon they're not just absurd, but they're also dangerous. I mean, the statues and made known to people what was useful to them. Similarly, they said of the trees, which were, I'm at the top of 517 now, which were assigned to the various planets, that when one particular tree was set apart for one planet, planted with a view to the latter, and a certain treatment was applied to it, and with it the spirit of that planet overflowed towards that tree. It gave prophetic revelation to people. I'm purposely not delving into this too much, because I think you get the idea. You will find all this set forth literally in their books, to which I shall draw your attention. These were the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah that I mentioned in our text. So when we learn the Torah, so now let's think for a moment. So the Rambam is saying what all of these books that I'm reading to you are explaining to us what those people were thinking. So when we read about the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah, when we read in the books of Melachim and Shoftim and Shmuel, right? The reason why we read about these is because what was happening then were these people that believed in these statues that communicated that within which the deity resided, and this each deity has his or her place where they had jurisdiction, so to speak. Among them, these opinions became so firm that they forsook the Lord, because they were so convinced by these things that they gave up on God completely and called, O Baal, answer us. All this came about because of these opinions being generally accepted, ignorance being widespread, and the world then often being given to raving, considering imaginings of this kind. Once you start imagining this, and once you believe that this thing is really the presence of the deity, right? Then all of a sudden you have all kinds of crazy ideas. Such opinions develop among them, became soothsayers, enchanters, sorcerers, charmers, consulters with spirits, wizards, and necromancers, all this stuff, right? The Rambam is very clearly saying that all of this is complete fantasy, complete baloney, right? The Rambam doesn't even have any place for imagining that there's any even smidgen of reality in this stuff, right? It's just this totally absurd, ignorant, etc. Imaginings. We have already made it clear in our great compilation Mishnah Torah that Avram Avinu began to refute these opinions by means of arguments and feeble preaching, conciliating people and drawing them to obedience by means of benefits. So the Rambam, Rambam had explained to us in Mishnah Torah that Avram Avinu, in order to try to start getting people away from that, he started telling them, no, this is not how it works, right? You don't gain benefits by somehow appeasing the God that's in the temple there, and somehow, because he's the God of rain, that somehow you'll get rain. That's not how it works, right? By telling you, Avram is telling people, according to Rambam's understanding, no, if you want to get benefits in this world, then you need to stop this nonsense, and you need to worship God, right? Worshiping God means living the way God wants us to live, acting in a proper way, and that's going to lead into the Torah, right? That's going to lead into the mitzvahs of the Torah. If you live this way, the world will be a better place, because these rules make sense. If you're charitable towards each other and honest towards each other, and you have empathy towards each other and so on, and compassion, so then all of a sudden you'll find a world which functions better. There's going to be less hunger. There's going to be less strife. There's going to be less, so on and so forth, less violence. Then the master of the prophets received prophetic inspiration. Then when Avram Avinu achieved this is when he achieved prophecy. Now remember, when the Rambam says prophecy, he means what the Rambam means when the Rambam says prophecy. Not what you and I might have thought prophecy meant, right? Before we learned Rambam, right? Remember, what does the Rambam think prophecy means, right? We talked about this several times. It's that tapping into that active intellect and judging things by truth, by what they really are, and being able to control your imaginary faculty of your mind with your intellect, so that the images that you see reflect what's really happening. And you can see, so this, according to Rambam, is prophecy. And I know I said it in a very short version because we studied it at length before. If you weren't with us then, I still advise that you go back and watch those lectures on prophecy. So anyway, Thereupon he perfected the purpose in that he commanded killing these people. At that point, the only way out was to get rid of the people that were teaching this nonsense. It was so thoroughly ingrained, and that way of the world was so incredibly dangerous. The only way to do it was to wipe out their traces and tear out their roots. He shall break down their altars and so on, and forbade following those ways of theirs in anything. And he shall not walk in the customs of the nation and so on. You have to stop this nonsense. We can't have anything to do with it. And that is why these commands, the Rambam is trying to develop a milieu within which those commands, which may not otherwise make sense, starts to make sense. Because that's the only way we can advance the truth. You know from the text of the Torah, figuring in a number of passages, that the first intention of the Torah as a whole is to put an end to idolatry. The Torah cannot thrive in a world where people are running around believing in nonsense, in stupid things, in imaginary things, in magical things, and things that don't exist in reality. The Torah cannot function, truth cannot function in a world where people believe in this stuff, right? And so much so that they think that they can manipulate the gods to get what they want, right? So we have to get rid of it. That's why the Torah is so devoted to getting rid of idolatry, to wipe out its traces and all that is bound up with it. Even its memory, as well as all that leads to any of its works. For instance, familiar spirits and a wizard and passing through fire and diviners and soothsayers and enchanters and sorcerers and charmers and necromancers. And to warn against doing anything at all similar to their work. Don't even do things that are similar to the stuff that they did, even if you don't believe in it. If they had a practice where they sliced their bodies in order to worship or something, and so maybe you shouldn't slice your body at all, even if you're not doing it to worship, right? It is explicitly stated in the text of the Torah that everything that was regarded by them as worship of their gods and as a way of coming near to them is hateful and odious to God. This is stated in his saying, for every abomination to the world which he hateth have they done unto their gods. Because why? Because when they're trying to nonsensically get some kind of benefit from an idol or from something that's an inanimate object or an animate object that has no power to provide what they're asking it for, then they start and you start believing in these kinds of magical ideas. Then you start thinking these practices will somehow appease these gods and get what you want. And the practices become more and more extreme until you do things that are disgusting. The verse that the Rambam is quoting talks about in the end, and they even brought their children as sacrifices. The Rambam isn't going to bring that, but that's the ultimate end to where that kind of corruption can lead. If that's what you actually believe, that this inanimate object can somehow be appeased and bring goodness to you, then you'll do anything to do it, even the most abhorrent and most nonsensical things, right? The Rambam is going to bring other examples, not as extreme, but I just want to tell you that if you look up that verse, that's what you'll find. You will find that in their books about which I shall give you information, right? They mention that under certain circumstances, they offer to the sun, their highest deity, 7 beetles, 7 mice, and 7 bats as a sacrifice. And that's how, so just, he's trying to show how stupid it is, right? You shacht 7 bats and 7 mice and 7 beetles, and then suddenly this alone is sufficient to arouse the disgust in human nature. Consequently, all the commandments that are concerned with the prohibition against idolatry. So understand this, that every time the Torah says you're not supposed to do things that are related to idolatry, you have to eradicate idolatry. You want to know the reason for it? Remember, we're in the section of the Rambam where he explains to us the logical reasons for the mitzvot. The reason is because we need to get rid of this terrible process, this terrible thought process, this terrible ideas about paganism. I want you to think, like, if you and I were to do the same exercise today, we wouldn't read this book about the Sabians, right? We would learn about the history of what the world was like. And I promise you that all of a sudden, much of the Torah will start to make even more sense than what the Rambam is saying right now. When we look back at pagan practice, when you read about the sacrifices of, the child sacrifices of the Inca Empire, or virtually every ancient society, there's these caves in Guatemala and in Mexico where the Mayans would throw the young toddlers into caves in the water to drown for sacrifices, or child sacrifice that's recorded in the Torah that the nations around in Mesopotamia used to do. You see things that are like abhorrent to the nth degree. I mean, we see these kinds of things happening in societies all around the world, right? And so when we see when we have real historical knowledge, when we have archaeology and history that's that we have access to, that the Rambam didn't have access to, the truth of what he's explaining to us here is even more stark, right? Why the Torah makes sense? Why was it so important to uproot these terrible ideas? I mean, I don't know what the right word is, but worse than terrible, right? So our manifest utility. So all these laws have a very, very sensible purpose. For all of them are meant to bring about deliverance from these unhealthy opinions that turn one's attention away from all that is useful with regard to the two perfections. Remember, I told you about two perfections, the Rambam said 2 chapters ago, right? Perfection in your life, in your body, and then perfection in your mind, right? So society has to be perfect. And these kinds of ideas that are nonsensical don't bring about a peaceful society. Believing that I need to appease a god in a temple with sacrifices is not a way to bring peace among people. It's not a way to build a healthy society, right? And it's certainly not a way to perfect us spiritually. So, with regard to and we need to take, because these unhealthy opinions turn you away from the perfections toward crazy notions in which our fathers and forefathers were brought up. As it says, your fathers dwelt of old time, excuse me, on the Terach, and they served other gods. It is about these notions that the truthful prophets have said, for they walked after vain things that do not profit. They chased after things that had no benefit. How great then is the utility of every commandment that delivers us from this great error and brings us back to the correct belief, namely that there is a deity who is the creator of all this, and it is he that ought to be worshipped and loved and feared, and not the things that are deemed to be gods. And that so we don't love and fear the sun, the moon, the stars, the trees, the mountains. We love and fear God, who's the creator of all of it, right? All of it in one big, beautiful unity. And that to come near to this true deity and to obtain his goodwill, how do you do it? Nothing is required that is fraught with any hardship whatsoever, right? You don't have to hurt yourself. You don't have to cut yourself. You don't have to starve yourself. None of those things do you have to do in order to come close to this God, because that's what happens when you try to start to appease these nonsensical gods. But for the real God, you don't have to do that. For these two, what you need is love and fear of God. And fear is not the right word, love and awe, right? Which the Rambam already explained to us where love comes from. Love of God comes from understanding nature and understanding the world that we live in, right? For these two are, as we shall explain, the end of divine worship, right? As now Israel, what doth the God, Lord the God require of thee, and so on. We shall exhaust this subject later on in later chapter in the sequel. So now, I'm going to end with this next paragraph, and then we'll have to continue. I shall now return to my purpose and say that the meaning of many of the laws became clear to me. And this paragraph, I think, is really important and a good way to end. That's just why I'm choosing it to end tonight. And their causes became known to me through my study of the doctrines, opinions, practices, and cult of the Sabians. How did I learn about this? If such important idea, how did I learn to understand the ideas of the Torah? Because I went and I studied the practices and the doctrines, opinions, and cult of the Sabians. I want you to think about that for a minute. How did I understand the Torah's mitzvos, and the meaning of the Torah's mitzvos? By studying his equivalent then of going and doing research, right, into the Sabians. Right? As you will hear when I explain the reasons for the commandments that are considered to be without cause. How did I try to understand the parts of the Torah which seemed to make no sense? I studied history, right? I shall mention to you the books from which all I know. I'm going to tell you which books I read, right? He already mentioned one, but this is going to give us a whole reading list for 10th century reading on the history of the Sabians, right? From which I know about the doctrines and opinions of the Sabians will become clear to you. So don't think I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm an expert in this matter. I read all the books, right? Everything that's in the library in Cairo, I read it all, right? And right. So you know for certain that what I say about the reason for that, you can rely on me. I'm well read. I know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to stop here because we're running out of time. but also I just, it's such incredibly powerful and such a breath of fresh air when you see how the Rambam went to understand the Torah. And I cannot possibly tell you how many people you talk to today, and they have this idea that you study the Torah by studying the Torah, right? You don't need to know science to understand the Torah. You don't need to know history. You don't need to know geography. You don't need to know geology. But no, that's the opposite of the truth. According to the Rambam, if you have a problem in the Torah, you need to understand general knowledge, right? It's crucial. It's the way to understand the Torah. And the Rambam just said it as clear as day, black on white. And if anyone tells you that he didn't say it, you can just probably better to continue the conversation about a different subject. But anyway, go ahead. I see there's a hand up. I'll give over the floor.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for the wonderful presentation. I agree 100% that we can't have idolatry. It leads
okay.
terrible things. So I'm on board. If Rambam had lived in the 20th century, and
right,
seen what happened when a society like the Nazis, like the Germans, came up with the conclusion following, I will say, a similar line of reasoning, but they looked at what's healthy for society. They made a judgment, what is dangerous for society. And out of that, a new word came into our vocabulary, genocide. Indeed, they sometimes used this example of wiping out the Amalekites implicitly, that there can be a justification for wiping out a people because it's so dangerous to society's values. I wonder if he would have changed some of Lisa's wording, suggesting that there has to be some qualifications to this line of thinking.
Yeah, well, we've ventured a little many times a little bit into that idea. What would the Rambam have said if he was around today, right? And obviously, the way you answer the way you finish that sentence, the Rambam would have if is going to be heavily influenced by our own perspective of the speaker, whoever is saying the first half of the sentence, right? So anything we say is obviously very highly speculative, right? So but I don't think it's unreasonable to make the assumption that the Rambam of all people emphasized over and over again the relentless search for truth, no matter what, right? And relentlessly seeking knowledge where knowledge needs to be sought. So it's hard to imagine that the Rambam wouldn't be like the most best read and most scientifically solid and relentlessly sticking with the truth of the science and of all the ologies, right? Sociology and even when it comes to so would he have thought differently today than he did then? I think it's almost certainly yes, right? So like we'll find places where he'll make certain assumptions that are offensive to us about women, for example. We've come across them already a few times, and we will again, right? And then when we understand the Rambam in the same way the Rambam is trying to understand the Torah, we have to understand him within the milieu that he lived and what was understood at the time. Would he have thought differently today? Almost certainly yes, although with the caveat that it's highly speculative, right? None of us know, right? I can't quote the Rambam in defense of women's suffrage or something like that if I wanted to, because he couldn't even have imagined such a thing in his life. He couldn't have imagined suffrage at all, for that matter, but certainly not women's suffrage, right? But would he have been, had he been alive in the 1920s, supportive of it? I don't know, but I think I have pretty solid reason to believe that he would have, but who knows? Does that answer the question?
Well, in part, and I didn't mean to suggest at all that he'd ever support the destruction of the Jews. I'm just saying that given the historical experience and what we've said, when your objective is to improve society,
Right.
Does that justify murder on a mass
Yeah,
scale?
if you would have confronted him with scientific evidence that there's much better ways to improve people's opinions than slaughtering them, he probably would have looked at the scientific evidence and said, okay, well,
That's
if that's what, then let's do it that way, right? Again, the caveat, I have no idea what he would have done, but I'm just saying, but his relentless search for truth is the defining thing of the Rambam. It has to be true. So if you show me evidence that XYZ is the best way to do something, he would go with XYZ. That's what I think. I don't know. I see. Jack, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, it was a really nice session. I really enjoyed it, and very well explained by you. He sort of didn't approach something that I was hoping I'd see him approach, because he's talking about idolatry and sacrifices by the pagans, but he doesn't correlate that with the fact that the Jews of the time also sacrificed to God, to our God. They did the same thing. It was just a different deity that they did it to.
Yes.
And how can he explain the fact that we're not doing the same thing that idolaters do? And
Yes. So
why should we have continued that? And it just doesn't. He doesn't explain why we do it, and we did it, and even today, some people say if the temple is rebuilt,
that we will do it again.
sacrifice again. When sacrifice seems to be something that's totally pagan and predates Abraham, predates Judaism, and is a pagan thing.
Yes, well, you're making an excellent point, but he does address it in length, and we're just didn't get there yet. He addresses, he's going to discuss exactly that topic at length. I forget it's about 7 or 8 chapters ahead. So hang in there. But the reason why I'm not going to get into it too much, just because I promise you we're going to deal with it at length. We're going to deal at length with how it's justified for Jews to bring sacrifices. If we just said that the way that they served these gods was wrong, right? So he's gonna address at length. He's not going to talk at length about why we would do it today and what will be in the future, but we will talk about it, though. I promise. Okay. I promise.
Okay.
I did bring it in way back in the early times in this lecture. I read it in maybe the 4th, 5th, or 6th lecture. I did quote that part of the Rambam. That was before I decided to just go consecutive and read. So I was kind of jumping around in the first few lectures, but then I'd settled down and said, no, we're just going to read from the beginning to the end, and that's it. So, which is what I'm doing now. I'm glad that today went well, because I'm getting a good reception, because I thought it was going to be kind of boring reading all this stuff about these Sabians, and most of it we know historically is nonsense. I mean, it's not, the book that the Rambam is quoting is a totally made up book. But like I told, but it's still a very worthwhile endeavor for people. I'm glad that you all enjoyed it a lot, because it still brings out the process of thought that the Rambam went through, which is the real crucial thing we have to learn from this, And
the other thing I wanted to ask, you talked about they suffered, they did crazy sacrifices, they cut themselves, they did all those things to appease the gods. And yet, Judaism has a lot of pain too. And you just said we shouldn't do that. For instance, fasting. I mean, I know there are reasons that are said why we fast, but it seems like that's a painful thing. And that, God would not want us to suffer and do that if that's really the way Rambam is saying. Why do we do those things if they're painful to us and they remind us of pagans that hurt themselves and made themselves uncomfortable and painful in the hopes that God would receive them because they do these painful things? Well, we sort of do the same thing with fasting, don't we? I mean, what's the deal?
Yes and no, and we will. I promise you, you're asking the best questions, but this is really what this entire section is going to be about, right? Rambam is trying to. I'm going to go way ahead of myself, but part of painting to us what the milieu was like when these mitzvot were given, right, is helping us understand the mindset of the Jews to whom these mitzvot were given at the time, right? So if you're used to, worshiping gods in a certain way with sacrifices, right, or by denying yourself certain pleasures like fasting and stuff like that, then it's very hard to come and tell you, all right, let's turn that all off, and now let's just sit down in the study hall and contemplate the wonders of the universe, right? Or stand in the, so all of a sudden you can't take us and change everything. So the Rambam is going to tell us with the sacrifices that at much more length than I'm about to do right now, but let's channel it in the right direction. Let's start moving these practices that people are used to, but focusing it on one God, right? But it's a partial answer to what you said. The longer answer, I promise, I'm not just punting. We're gonna be doing this. This is the process, right? He's laying these ideas down so that the next 20 chapters he's going to go through the mitzvot of the Torah. In some cases, he may not touch on specific things, but he does in depth touch on it in the Mishnah Torah, right? Where he talks about each mitzvah. He'll talk about why we fast on Yom Kippur, for example. We look in the Mishnah Torah and he writes about that at length. So he tries to make sense out of these things, and the questions you're asking are good ones. They're very good ones, and they're the right questions, and we will be answering them. I promise.
Okay, I can wait.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Anything else before we close up for the evening? Anyone else have I see there's a couple new names. I see a Kelly, I think. I don't know who everyone is, but welcome and thank you so much for joining us. And let's looking forward to next week, and it'll be next week, Wednesday night, with God's help. Have a wonderful evening. And yes. And as Robert, are you new also?
I'm not new. I've been here 3 or 4 sessions, but
okay, I've seen your name pop up already. That's why I didn't call you. But anyway, welcome. I didn't welcome you before, so welcome now.
Thank you.
All right. Be well, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.